Good af good afternoon. I assume since we're virtual, I can take off my mask. Um, as you know, we spent a lot of time virtual in the last 6 or 8 months. So let me welcome everybody to the third edition of the Dean's Forum, and hope everybody's staying safe. As we move into the holiday season, many of us begin to think about holiday traditions, holiday treats, and maybe particularly holiday eats and things that we might like to eat, like turkey, dressing, pumpkin pie, and maybe most especially gingerbread. And so I like mine with a lemon sauce on it, but I know other people like icing and other things on it, chocolate even. Um, but gingerbread is more than just a food, it's also a magical building material. And so today we're going to talk about the feasibility of using gingerbread as a construction material. And today we're joined by four of the architecture faculty: Associate Dean Michelle Reinhardt, Russell Gentry, um, Julie Kim, and Danielle Wilkins. Let me start things off by thinking about the structural feasibility. Could you really use gingerbread to build a full-size house?
Well, I'm going to ask a question first because some people have kind of a spongy gingerbread that's kind of flexible, and some people leave it in the oven till it gets really stiff and crispy. So what kind of gingerbread are we using?
Well, Russell, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about the difference between a sun-baked brick and a brick that where you're able to kind of get it in the oven, right? So if we think historically back to Mesopotamia, sun-baked brick only goes so far. It's pretty brittle. It has to be covered in something, which you can certainly do with all that sugar. But a hardened brick that's baked in the oven, the much thicker, sturdier, could scale up a little better, right?
Sure.
It seems that you'd have to plan for the unpredictability. As I bake, and I'll make the same recipe multiple times, and I'll be convinced that I'm using the exact same amount of flour and sugar, vanilla, baking soda, and yet each time I bake, let's say, a dozen cookies or biscuits or something, it's always just a little bit different, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is. So it seems like you would have to think about that, so that you have consistency with maybe using the same oven, maintaining the kind of consistent temperature. So it seems like you would have to think about it as almost like a science experiment and plan for some failures along the way, which just means you would have more gingerbread to snack on as you're baking.
I'd pose a little thought experiment. Then this is something, Michelle, you could do in your oven. If we had a whole sheet of gingerbread you were cooking, and you could start getting pieces out of the oven after what, 12 minutes? However long it takes to cook a cookie, but then maybe 15 minutes, 18 minutes, 21 minutes, and seeing how the material would change. We can all imagine in our mind it getting darker and thinner, but would it actually be getting stronger? You're getting the moisture out. Are you actually, what's actually happening? You're the baker. What's actually happening when you cook something?
Well, and I think that varies. It's also based on that thickness, as you talked about, that kind of chewy, soft, which is my favorite kind of gingerbread personally, versus like
Especially
a gingerbread.
for chocolate chip cookies.
Yeah, well, yeah, I like them sort of gooey and almost raw, which probably doesn't have a lot of structural stability at all. But I like the super thick gingerbread that's kind of just a little soft. And I think about that as like being a good thermal mass, right? You're able to kind of absorb and store heat, so it has a certain kind of environmental advantage. But at the same time, it's going to absorb a lot of moisture, much more moisture than if you were to kind of have a nice crispy cookie. And so then you might kind of get your structure really soggy, and then that's going to be bound for collapse too, as well.
I would, that's an, the interesting question about that is when you think about where we're located in Atlanta, Georgia. Of course, it gets very humid here, so I would imagine that the humidity would dramatically affect the gingerbread house. That would definitely threaten the stability of the structure. Just as things kind of get soft. So I think that would be difficult. So, but if you could think about a way of integrating air conditioning in the gingerbread house, that would be interesting.
And I think the other trick of that would just be that every single forest creature would absolutely love your house. So as you're building, if your builders aren't snacking on the structure too much, you're going to be stuck with squirrels and chipmunks and everything else taking over your structure as you create it. So I think that would be a tricky thing to ensure that you'd actually be able to finish.
So would it be comfortable to live in a gingerbread house?
Well, that's interesting. So what would happen to a material like gingerbread is it would certainly absorb a lot of moisture over time. So it would act as a desiccant for a while. So in the South, that wouldn't be so bad to have all that moisture sucked into the house. But then, unfortunately, I think the material properties would degrade over time with that uptake in moisture. So it probably would start to sag, and probably many people in older wood homes, especially if they have wet basements, are probably familiar with that as well, that over time wood structures that are constantly moist and wet tend to sag as well.
Yeah, I think your bathroom would be pretty tricky. I don't know how a shower would work in a gingerbread house. Like those, maybe you have an outhouse. I don't know, a candy cane outhouse or something. But yeah, and I think what about a downpour? I think all your icing suddenly just every little bit of structural glue to your gingerbread house is shot after one good storm. Yeah,
That's right. That's right.
Be interesting to think about in general, how do material properties drive the design?
Well, I think the thing that's interesting, when I was talking about gingerbread as being kind of an unpredictable medium, because you think about kind of the mix ratio and wanting to also maintain kind of consistency with each batch, that you can draw kind of similarities to the way that we approach just a general design problem. Whether it's doing an investigation in a construction technology class where you're working with plaster and formwork, or in a design studio where you're trying to think about a bunch of different conditions and kind of testing and experimenting, and being able to accept failures, along the way, and learning from those.
Problem with gingerbread is it's really brittle, so much like concrete. And so the Romans had great concrete, but the Romans didn't have any tension reinforcement. So the Roman structures that we still have out of concrete are either arches or domes or paving. But now we see these tremendous concrete structures, and with only a modest amount, maybe 2% steel, we turn concrete into a magical material because we can resist tension. But the gingerbread doesn't resist any tension, right? It cracks very easily. So what in your baking can we do to add tension?
Yeah, so what would be a good tensile material?
How about asparagus?
No, that would be disgusting.
Like a flat licorice, potentially.
I thought of licorice earlier too.
Exactly. That was going to be what I say, because I love black licorice. It is like one of my absolute favorites.
Me too.
So a little, but it's not. There's still some flexibility in a good licorice rope. You need something a little sturdier. Could you use like a peppermint stick?
Well, it's interesting because the stiffness of licorice is highly compliant, so it could act like a strand. So if you wanted a a gingerbread house that had
Yeah.
kind of a funicular structure, then you could hang it from like Fry Otto's Munich Olympic Stadium. You could
Yeah.
hang the gingerbread from some licorice cables. So that might be one way to get some span, and maybe
You
a
could do
more
a licorice
modernist
bridge.
gingerbread house.
Yeah. A licorice bridge could work.
Yeah.
Well, you've got the gumdrops, which have kind of they're dense, but they could kind of create kind of a like an asphalt surface. Isn't that disgusting? But that helps to kind of provide waterproofing. Then the other is this whole idea of the Jolly Rancher. Right? We haven't not talked about the Jolly Rancher yet. If you take Jolly Ranchers and you heat them up, you can actually melt them into thin planes, and sort of start to create stained glass out of Jolly Ranchers. So we haven't talked about window openings and fenestration, but the Jolly Ranchers would provide that perfect opportunity.
Because it seems that you would have to make a commitment to either the windows being fixed and so always staying shut, or having just openings with some sort of I'm thinking about the lattice, or like a lattice screen that would always allow the kind of air to move through, but that you wouldn't be able to have the double hung or even the casement, the operable. That would be a tricky challenge to think about how you could accommodate that.
Or some other kind of like sugar. I'm trying to picture those thin coatings. But again, like water, you're in trouble the second that happens.
I know. Because it has to be something edible. So you can't insert like a sheet of plastic here or something like that, because
Right.
who wants to eat plastic? No thanks.
How about roofing material? Gumdrops?
So there's Lebkuchen, which is a kind of a typical, traditional gingerbread cookie that you have at Christmas in Germany, that sometimes has an iced coating that helps to kind of protect against, that might help against snow. My favorite is Printen, which is made in Aachen, and it's you can get them very large planks, and they're really kind of thick, and they're kind of soft and squishy, and then often covered in chocolate. My favorite's the dark chocolate. But that would also help against the snow. And then when I make it at home, I make it with rock candy that you grind up and put in there, and so it has some aggregate, much like the reason why we would have aggregate in concrete. And then sometimes you can get it where it has a lot of nuts inside of it. I don't like that because I don't believe that nuts and chocolate should mix together. But that would be another good sturdy aggregate.
We have to kind of decide what the fundamental nature of the structure is. Is it going to be a compressive structure where the materials are pushing on each other like bricks sometimes do? Or do we have to have floors? Everyone thinks the pyramids were cool, but there wasn't much occupiable space in a pyramid. Maybe it was a good place to go to die, but you wouldn't want to live there. So, if you really wanted open spaces, we'd need to make our gingerbread able to span and have some open floors. Or maybe we'd have to build, aqueducts out of gingerbread.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, so maybe it's not gingerbread planks. You actually start to think about stones that could form an arch. And if it's done well, it doesn't necessarily need mortar, right? It's a dry jointed arch. That could certainly work.
So that would be better than the typical salt box house that we usually see people making with gingerbread. That has like the slanted roof and the vertical walls.
Yeah, I think that's exactly why they're doing that. They're using a steep-pitched roof because ultimately you can think about even a piece of gingerbread that's been cooked really well. It really has a high compressive strength, maybe like a piece of chalk. But as soon as you flex it just a little bit, the tensile capacity is pretty limiting. And so with the high-pitched roof, you don't get much tension. So really the trick would be to maybe use Michelle's strategies and have a kind of a corbelled look, right? To corbel the gingerbread or to have an arch.
Wow. So, at my understanding, this is probably not the right material for Frank Lloyd Wright with the flat roofs.
Exactly.
It's
And
probably
I'm
not,
thinking,
though.
I don't know how you'd make a Zaha Hadid gingerbread house. That would be pretty wild.
Yeah.
That with all the curves and everything, or a Gary version, that would be pretty tricky.
Yeah,
Or you've
that
got like
would
a
be tricky.
deconstructivist. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I guess depending on your baking and your building skills, the house might just by default become a deconstructivist house. But I
Right,
would
right.
say that with a modern house, just like in real life, there's not as much tolerance for making kind of mistakes in those houses. And so with a traditional house, you have the kind of the overlaps and the details. And seems that with a gingerbread house that's made in a more traditional mode, that you could just include more icing as kind of the glue that holds it together, whereas in a modern house it'd be less forgiving, in that way. You'd have to be super precise in a
Let me
modern
just say,
aesthetic.
I'm always for more icing.
Yeah,
No
Yeah,
matter what the
yeah.
problem, more icing.
I agree. I love icing.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that both Julie and I were touching on was the idea that gingerbread isn't just the only material. And if we look around the built environment, if a house is made out of bricks, you've got the bricks, you've got the mortar, you've got your windows, which might be wood or steel, and then the glass. So you have all these different combinations, and the materials work in combinations quite well in certain instances, and other ones, like those material combinations, can actually be really detrimental. So like that's not something we talked about, but what would happen if you would put some sort of ingredient against the gingerbread that would actually cause it to degrade, which can happen in real life with a real material.
Mhm.
So all these things are in combination, and you have to think about how they work as a system together, and it's not just in isolation. Maybe we'll get there at some point where we can 3D print a whole building out of one conglomerate material, but we're not there yet.
Yes. So when I think about a gingerbread house, I think about a Swiss chalet, and I don't know if there's a history lesson there, but we need an architectural historian of gingerbread houses to help us understand, culturally where they come from. Was it a German or an Austrian or a Swiss tradition primarily? And so what we're
Mm-hmm.
used to seeing is, the high-pitched roofs that were meant to shed snow and the kind of small, ornate windows, all of which lead
Mm-hmm.
themselves to those materials which don't have much strength and that stack well on top of one another. So in the U.S. building tradition, I think it's a real challenge for gingerbread, given its kind of deficient structural properties, let's say.
I think the Nordic ones, you've got the really steep slope, so you have less of a wall area, so it's more of a A-frame. So I guess structurally, you kind of cut down the amount of connections, which could be useful. Um, and but I guess for both of those, I'm thinking of almost like the filigree that's attached to all those structures, which is literally how we then interpreted gingerbread for like the Victorian era. You talk about the gingerbread on the house being these really elaborately scrolled wooden pieces, and they're decorative, they're not structural. So I'd actually love to see like a Japanese gingerbread house. I think that would be like mind blowing to think about how the joinery is both a decorative component, but completely structural. So I think that intermixing could be really fun. Or you go the kind of opposite geographical destination or location, and you say, what is a early American like Western gingerbread house look like? Like I'm thinking of the Yellowstone kind of structures, these incredible log cabins. Like that could be like a rustic gingerbread house. And maybe that leaves you a little bit of room for error if your gingerbread's not baked so well. So you can just
Or,
say it's kind of au naturel. Yeah.
or even thinking about an idea of is there a gingerbread version of Lincoln logs,
Mm.
where they kind of stack and they interlock with each other, and then that forms, and then they become structural, in and of themselves. I really like what you were saying, Danielle, about the Japanese influences, because I was just imagining, again, like how you would build the various components and what would be the sweet, sugary materials that would form the kind of roof, and then the structure, as well.
Yeah, yeah. You got it. I got a different palette there because there'd probably be something with, rice cakes or
Yeah.
a different, I don't know. Is it wasabi that's holding it instead of icing? It's a spicy gingerbread house.
Oh, that
So,
would be an unhappy surprise if someone thought it was
yeah,
pistachio or something like that,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
it's actually wasabi.
All right. Well, thank you. I hope everyone has a safe and wonderful holiday season. And let's hope 2021 is better than 2020.
Exactly. And I'm going to go off and bake a cranberry ricotta cake today.
Wow.
Wow. We're coming over.
As long as you clean the house too.